Chapter 7. Soon after moving to Paris, I remember going down to a French television station at the time the Americans were pulling out of Vietnam. I remember sitting there in a chair watching the unedited video signals coming in from Vietnam, showing the Marines and GIs leaving. There was one especially patriotic image of the U.S. ambassador to Cambodia leaving with the American flag tucked under his arm. There was a lump in my throat. I was sitting between the editor of Germany's Der Spiegel magazine and a man from a very prestigious French newspaper called Le Monde Diplomatique. As the scenes of the helicopters leaving and soldiers waving were flashed before us, the men beside me were just laughing. The more they laughed, the more I resented it. They started talking about the U.S. Marines as nothing more than Boy Scouts who couldn't win a fight against an old ladies' club. I'd had enough, and without any forethought said to the Frenchman, "You know what, man? There was a day when you were mighty glad to see the U.S. military liberate you from him." I nodded toward the German sitting on the other side of me. I could hardly believe the change that was taking place inside me. More and more comments like that just seemed to pop out of my mouth. The German and French journalists were shocked and angry. I just got up and went home. I began to feel a real sadness at being a fugitive. I wanted to go home, and I couldn't. We had to be careful where we went and who we talked to. We had to be very secretive about where we kept our children, often keeping them in hiding at places separate from where we were staying. One of the problems with children is that it's hard to teach them to lie. You can't trust them to help you keep your cover. Like when I would try to tell my children that for a while my name was Henry Jones, not Eldridge Cleaver. They'd say, "No, it's not. You're Eldridge Cleaver." We kept the children in hiding for an entire year. At the time, my lawyer was Roland Dumas, who today is the foreign minister of France. I liked the man, but to see him appointed foreign minister of a major Western power is an indication to me of how much the world has changed. Georges Pompidou, who is now president of France, sponsored my petition for political asylum. When Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew resigned, it appeared changes were taking place in the United States, and I began to think it was possible for me to return home. I began contacting my old friends in the States, asking them to help me come home. One of them, Mervyn Dimley, had become lieutenant governor in California. An old friend, Ron Delmas, whom the Black Panthers used to protect, was now a congressman. Both of them were good friends with Jerry Brown, the new governor of California. I thought they could help me arrange to come home. They kept putting me off, like telling me to wait until after the next election was over. Then one of my friends came over and told me that whenever I would send a message expressing my desire to come home, everyone would just laugh. After what I had done, they just thought there was no way I could ever come home without spending the rest of my life in prison. My friend's advice was that I learn French real good, because I was probably going to spend the rest of my life in France. That was the last thing that friend should have said to me. I was under a lot of strain, feeling like I was being pushed down a path to some kind of extinction. When Socrates was faced with a choice between suicide or exile, he chose suicide. I was beginning to understand why he did that. To the new Eldridge Cleaver, exile was a form of death. At that time, Paris was full of American exiles. Some of the black ones we would call French-fried Negroes. There were all kinds, just getting away from America for all kinds of reasons. When you would talk to these people, you could see they were frozen in some kind of time frame, reflecting the period when they had left the United States. If you ran into a man who said, "Hey, Daddy-O," you knew he'd left in the 50s. Then there's the cool school. "What's happening, man? What it is? Cool, man." You knew this fellow had left in the early 60s. Then you had the angry guys, my generations, the ones who'd left in the late 60s. I could see myself becoming like them, my language, even thinking, everything frozen in time. I was a fish out of water. I was concerned and homesick, especially the day my children came home from school and told us not to speak to them in English anymore because it hurt their ears. They were in the French school system, doing all their reading and writing in French, and it was confusing to them when they came home to English. When they said English hurt their ears, I was hurt. I could see my children becoming French, and I wanted them to be Americans, not just on paper, but to really know what it meant to be an American. I was sad. I became more and more downcast, particularly the day my son came home playing soccer. He called it football. I'd been a football player, my favorite sport. I idolized American football players. I wanted my son to be a real football player, not a soccer player. I felt we had to get out of there, and I just didn't know what to do since my friends said they couldn't help me come back. I don't think they wanted me to come back. I began to feel that my life wasn't worthwhile anymore, that it had become meaningless. I began to think that maybe I should just eliminate myself. If I took my life, my wife and children would be free to return to the United States. I became possessed with the idea of committing suicide and decided to do it. I knew that I could do it once I made up my mind. It seemed to be the best way out of the whole mess. My family lived in Paris, but I also had an apartment down on the Mediterranean near Cannes, where they hold the film festival. All my papers and file cabinets were there. I went there whenever I wanted to write. And as I became more and more depressed with my situation, I spent more and more time in the south of France at this apartment. It was there that I made the decision to kill myself. I went back to Paris to see my family for one last time, to say goodbye to them. I didn't tell them what I was planning to do, but in my heart I just had to see them one last time. We had a little dinner that night, and I remember there were candles on the table, and we had turned out all the lights. To me, the evening seemed symbolic of our life in France. Lots of darkness, very little light, a miserable existence in which we were just marking time and not going anywhere. I looked at my wife and children and said goodbye to them for what I thought was the last time. The next morning, I flew back down to the south of France. I was determined to do it that night. Upon arriving at my apartment, I just sat around, waiting for a certain feeling to come over me. Whenever I had done anything drastic in my life, and this was certainly going to be the most drastic thing I had ever done, I couldn't do it until a certain spirit came over me. And when that spirit would fill me, no matter what it was I was about to do, I was gung-ho about it, no matter the consequences. I was trying to work myself up to having that spirit in me. Soon the whole day had passed and it was getting dark. I was sitting on the balcony, the 13th floor of the building. I had a pistol in my hand. I just felt the spirit would come over me at any time, and I would raise the gun to my head and pull the trigger. It would be all over. As I sat there, just staring out into the night, I began to notice the moon, almost a full moon. It looked so big. I was fascinated with the moon that night. The brilliance captivated me. It was like I could almost see it moving above the horizon. I began to see the shadows on the moon's surface. Pretty soon something very strange started to happen. I was feeling kind of excited anyway, but as I continued to stare at the moon, it began to flicker and change. I began to see images of people. First I saw myself in the moon. In the flickering, my face was hard to recognize. Then I saw my former heroes in communism, the people who at one time had become gods in my eyes. Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, Karl Marx. Their faces would flicker and go away. Suddenly I saw the image of Jesus Christ. When I saw that, I just fell apart. I was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I was shaking everywhere, inside and out. I started to get a feeling of panic about the pistol. Something told me to get that pistol out of my hand. I put it down on the table. Then I fell to my knees and started crying. Inside, I just exploded, shaking, crying, hanging onto the balcony railing. I felt like I was going to disintegrate and physically fall apart right there on that balcony. Suddenly, into my mind came the Lord's Prayer in the 23rd Psalm. You talk about going backward in time. I hadn't thought about the Lord's Prayer since I was a child, or the 23rd Psalm since my mother had read it to me while I sat on her knee. I found I could remember them, and I began to repeat the words to myself. As I did so, the trembling and crying gradually went away. I repeated the words over and over. Pretty soon the shaking stopped completely. I jumped up and ran into the room to the bookshelf where there was a Bible. It was a family Bible my mother had given me. When I left San Francisco, I hadn't even thought about bringing it along, but my wife later told me that when she was leaving, just abandoning our house, taking just what she could carry, that just as she was going out the door, that Bible seemed to say, "Hey, take me." She picked it up and put it in her bag. Afterward, we had always kept it among our books. I opened it and started looking for the Lord's Prayer. I didn't know where to find it. I couldn't find the 23rd Psalm either. I was thumbing through the pages over and over again. Suddenly I was overwhelmed with a spirit of peace and total exhaustion at the same time. I set the Bible down right next to the pistol. I collapsed on the bed and fell into a deep sleep. The next thing I remember, I woke up with a start as if someone had shaken the bed. It was morning. I jumped straight up. The things that had happened the night before flashed before my eyes. My whole spirit was quickened. I saw myself looking down a path of light that led to a prison cell and came out the other side. It was suddenly very clear to me what I must do. I had received a spiritual message that I must surrender to the authorities, go into that prison cell, and I would come out on the other side. There was no fear. I just knew I would come out the other side. I felt like a new person. My attitude had changed. I felt energy, a liveliness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I thought over the things that had happened the night before and wondered if perhaps I was going crazy, but a peaceful feeling in my heart told me everything was fine. I had no telephone in the apartment with which to contact anyone, so I folded up my stuff and ran downstairs and caught a plane back to Paris. I had to talk to Kathleen. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before, and I had to tell someone about it. It was very clear in my mind what I had to do. That evening I waited until after dinner and things had quieted down. I was watching her closely, wondering how she would react to what I was about to say. I began to fear that she would say I was crazy, and that would devastate me. "Kathleen," I said, looking at her very closely, "something very strange happened to me last night." I told her what had happened on the balcony, that I was going to surrender to the authorities and we were going home. Her eyes lit up and she actually jumped, like she had been shocked. "Are you sure?" she said. "Oh yes," I said. We started making plans right then. We were going home.